Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of On the Ballot. I'm your host, Norm Leahy, a senior editor here at Ballotpedia. And, of course, many of you know, read the Daily Brew, watch the news. There was an election on November 4th. Very interesting election, very interesting results, not just in the major races along the eastern seaboard, but there was some other stuff going on really across the country, because when you pull back the lens just a little bit, you realize that there were probably hundreds and hundreds of elections, many of those for local offices. But to help us really get beyond the headlines and look at what's going on a little bit deeper and maybe look a little bit ahead on what these results might mean is J. Miles Coleman. He's from the University of Virginia's Center for Politics and is an associate editor for the great newsletter Sabato's Crystal Ball, and a product of Louisiana State University. So, Miles, welcome. I will not mention a certain football coach who was recently let go from the university.
Oh, no, that's fine. Thanks so much for having me.
Now, I want to start off with a question that I guess is kind of perennial where we are these days, and that's with polling. It seems that in places like Virginia, where you and I are based, the polling on the statewide races did pretty well. It wasn't so bad, but in places like New Jersey, it really missed the boat. What helps explain why some polling was better than others and why some got it apparently so wrong?
And I'm always kind of, one thing I might say kind of to start is I don't want to be, too harsh on pollsters, because I feel like they have a tough job these days overall, because, I think people tend to expect perfection, or at least, but anyway, it kind of reminds me of one of my friends is a pollster named Noah Rudnick, who is a really kind of smart guy. And one of the things he was saying all year, or at least for the past few months, is let's not even look at New Jersey, a state like Virginia, which they missed, a smaller miss, but if you look at how the pollsters were weighing their models, more or less, they were kind of weighing it to an electorate that looked more like 2021. And even in a lot of those polls, basically Spanberg always led, but it stood to reason that, okay, well, if she's up by 5 or 8 points in a poll that has a more Republican leaning universe, if the electorate that actually shows up is a bit more blue, then it stands to reason that she probably does have more upside, and she ends up winning by closer to 15 points. The kind of miss in New Jersey was something else, but it's kind of maybe rare these days, I guess, especially in the kind we kind of came out of a presidential election where the polls have been accused of underestimating the Republicans. In a lot of cases this year, they underestimated the kind of other party.
Yeah, and it wasn't, and which is fair. Pollsters do have a good job, or they have good jobs, but they have very hard jobs too, because they're essentially trying to predict the future, which, as we know, is almost impossible, even for weathermen. So, but let's.
Maybe one more thing I'll quickly say on polling is, kind of after the elections, a lot of people online were kind of making fun of the RCP polling average, where if you look at the Virginia Attorney General race, which was kind of the toss-up race here, at least that was the perception. But like apparently, I think they took their average of that race offline after the election because it showed the Republican up. But I think something that was interesting about that race is if you looked at a lot of polls of the Virginia Attorney General race, specifically after one of the scandals last month, Jason Miyares was oftentimes ahead in polls, but he was oftentimes not taking much than 47% of the vote, which is what he got. So, I think a lot of those Jones voters, the kind of Democrat, were kind of camped out in the undecided camp, kind of came home towards the end of the elections. So that's why I say sometimes, I know when we analyze polls, sometimes it's worth looking at things like the percent share in addition to things like the kind of overall margins as well.
And speaking of the attorney general race in Virginia, which a lot of people kind of thought the Republican might win, but ended up losing. Out of all of the races that you looked at from November 4th, what outcome surprised you the most? Was it that race? Was it something else?
I would say the Virginia Attorney General race. I always thought it was a toss-up, but at the end of the day, right? I thought the Miares camp and the Republicans were asking vote. Kind of the swing group in that election was kind of the soft Spanberger voters. And at the end of the day, I think they were asking them to do something that's kind of counterintuitive, right? Because if I'm voting for Spanberger, I'm going to probably want an attorney general who's not going to be undermining her whole term. I could see if Jones was maybe the nominee for lieutenant governor, which was a job that's not as high profile. But I kind of I wasn't too surprised Jones won, given that I just figured a lot of his voters had moved to the undecided camp after the scandal, but were going to come home eventually. I would say in Virginia, one of the biggest surprises was the state House of Delegates, where kind of it something that reminded me of is really the first election I followed was the '08 election. I kind of started following politics with Obama, and in '06 the Democrats took a 51 seat majority in the Senate, and in the '08 election, when the kind of Democrats were looking towards the down ballot contest that year, one of their mottos for the Senate races that year was, 60 is the new 50, right? We just got to a majority. Now we need to get that super majority. And you could basically apply that to the Virginia House of Delegates this year, right? Because they got in 2023, the Democrats got a 51 seat majority. And then this year, you could see at the end of the election, it was kind of realistic that they could get more than 60 seats, but they ended up with 64, kind of sticking to, just the Democrats, flipping seats left and right. They picked up 13 seats. What was kind of a really ironic result is Delegate Kerry Coyner, who was one of the Republicans who had a district that Kamala Harris carried last year, always thought to be vulnerable. But she was the Republican, if some of your listeners recall that Jay Jones was sending his text too, and she lost her seat, and which is kind of crazy. And I would say, other than we've talked a lot about Virginia, but just the margins in those two public service commission races in Georgia, the Democrats won by 20 points. So I think, what I understand, kind of the election was held concurrently with some of the local stuff in Atlanta, so that probably helps stuff at the margins. But I feel like, as nationalized as these elections can get, which in these days it's a lot, but I was talking to one of my friends in Georgia, and it's like, look, it's people are just kind of sick of high energy prices, so they're going to do something different. So it's maybe something to keep in mind as well.
Well, and looking farther afield, there were places like Mississippi where Democrats, I think, they broke the Republicans' supermajority in the state Senate there. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that was kind of a surprise. And you saw other narratives spin out. But one of the things that we saw coming out of this, and it's probably because the press is located between Washington, D.C. and New York City, is that there was a big focus on those Eastern Seaboard races. And two themes emerged. You had moderates winning governorships. You had a Democratic Socialist winning the New York mayoral race. So, and those are two storylines, and they those sell newspapers. But from from a political analyst and a political pros perspective, what do you think the narrative is, the storyline, the big one coming out of these November 4th elections is to you? What is it to you?
Yeah, I mean, I got asked this question a lot about how, basically you kind of think of this continuum with, Cheryl and Spangler at one end, kind of Zoran Mamdani at the kind of their end is, I think it's really kind of, one of the through lines was basically even Mamdani as a Democratic socialist, he had this relentless focus on affordability. We kind of mentioned that when we were talking about Georgia. And you are kind of seeing it right now where I think one of the kind of clips that the Democrats are going to be using in a lot of ads next year is you had Trump at the White House saying, "Oh, I'm sick of hearing about affordability." It's like he's it's almost like he's starting to get in the position that Joe Biden was a few years ago, where okay, look, basically prices are high, stuff might look great, but just don't believe it, right? That's what they're telling. So it's and what I would say also, I mean, I think this might suggest that just for the Republicans, when Trump is off the ballot, they just have a hard time closing the kind of deal. It's one of the biggest groups that Spanberger made improvements kind of with compared to 2021. If you divide the electorate by education, almost all of her improvement came with non-college voters. So that's usually the kind of demographic that Trump did well with. I mean, she kind of still lost them, but closed the gap a lot. That is, I know, that's a portion of the electorate where, kind of, if the Democrats can just improve by a little bit in some of these key House races, that could, really go a long way. One of the kind of bigger picture takeaways I thought as well is really one of the bigger storylines out of last year was Trump's gains with minorities. I'm looking at some of the numbers out of this election, and just those 24 numbers look like such an outlier. I mean, it is one of the big surprises last year was Trump carried in New Jersey. He carried the state's 9th congressional district, which is heavily Hispanic, kind of some of the, I think it's based around basically, I think it's the seat that's based in Patterson, which is kind of heavily Hispanic. This year, Mikey Sherrill won that district by 19 points, which is the same margin that it gave Joe Biden. So I think it really established maybe the Hispanics as like a very key demographic that could decide elections.
And other things that we saw were, for example, ballot measures. The big one, Prop 50 in California, which allowed the legislature to redraw the congressional district boundaries through 2030. And then, of course, there was another one in Maine where voters rejected a voter ID, for a broad term voter ID measure there. So can we take anything away from those kinds of results?
Yeah, I would say in terms, the biggest one I was watching was Proposition 15 California. And, something I think that was important on that one is just to watch the Prop 50 margin relative to how Kamala Harris did last year. She won the state by basically 60-40. So anything under that, I don't think would have boded well for, during this whole kind of redistricting fight, which was a whole podcast in itself. But, in our state, we have the Democrats in Virginia trying to do something similar. I think if Prop 50 only passed by, 10, 15 points in a state that Kamala Harris won by 20, Virginia, which is a Harris plus 6 state, kind of Democrats might not have as much room for error, but from everything I've seen, it's probably going to pass by a bigger margin. So that may give the Virginia Democrats some encouragement. But yeah, I mean, I think that was probably basically Prop 15 California. That was the most consequential ballot measure we may have had in several cycles, because that could determine control of the House right there.
And obviously, you and I and others will be watching as the 2026 congressional midterms unfold. And, filing deadlines are already coming up on some of those races in some states. So it's not like we can take a breath and wait for these elections to come at us, because they're already barreling down the highway at us. But if you were to look at one thing, and right now, take one, let me say it this way. Virginia has typically been a test bed for messages. It may not be a bellwether on results specifically, but certainly for messaging. And so you think one of the things that we should look forward to in 26 a lot in these races is affordability and the cost of living. And the other thing that you alluded to was was Donald Trump's not being on the ballot. He's not going to be on the ballot anymore. 2024 was his last time. So combine those things together, and what do you think this is a prognostication. Last question. I'm not going to hold you to it. What do you think the landscape looks like for the major parties next year?
Yeah, it's I mean, I think if the election was next week, I think Democrats probably flip the House of Representatives. The Senate, I think is going to still be uphill, just because of what states are basically up. But really the big kind of, as I'm sure your listeners are kind of looking forward to, as well as the kind of biggest shoe that's waiting to drop is what happens with Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. That could have some very big implications in the kind of House. One thing I'm looking for is we were talking about the polls a bit earlier. In our polls, the generic ballot is still fairly close. I mean, it's not the kind of Democrats are typically up, but not as much maybe as what they were in 2017 or 2018. The Republicans seem to be doing a little better than what Trump's approval ratings might suggest. So I guess watch that gap maybe going forward. If the Republican, if their share in the House generic ballot starts to align more with what Trump is, or kind of where he's at, that may bode better for the kind of Democrats. One thing I would say as well is, it is, at the end of the day, this might be like Trump's second midterm, which, those were elections that did not go well for Bush, Obama. So we might be in that same type of environment. I mean, it is, this is kind of something I always tell to younger people who are getting into elections is, if you have a bad election, another one is you're probably going to have one that's a little bit better, pretty close around the kind of corner. It's I kind of mentioned a bit earlier that I first got into following electoral politics in 2008 with Obama. After that election, the Democrats thought that they had beat the Republicans forever. And what happens in Obama's next midterm, right?
Right. Yeah. It's amazing how cyclical and circular these things can be, but that's why we're here, and that's why we love this stuff. And Miles, I really do appreciate you joining us today on the ballot to discuss this. Thank you again for sharing your insights. Appreciate it.
Oh, sure. Thank you so much for having me.
And to everybody else, all our listeners and viewers on YouTube, yes, you can see us on YouTube, and you can listen to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And until our next time, I'm Norm Leahy, your host, and I'll be back with you with another episode of On the Ballot soon. And until then, I will see you in the digital pages of Ballotpedia. Take care.